She was 70 years old. Her hair was silver, her body marked by time, her eyes the color of storms that had seen too much. In another age, she might have been remembered as a survivor, a queen who outlasted empires, who buried her enemies one by one. But on that day, in the year 613, Queen Brunhilde stood naked in a cold field surrounded by thousands of people who had come not to honor her, but to watch her die. They laughed. They threw stones. They shouted words that could cut deeper than any blade. And as she stood there, shivering under the open sky, she understood what was happening, that her death was not meant to be quick. It was meant to be remembered. This is not a story about power. It is a story about fear, the fear that men have always felt when a woman holds too much of it. And it is a story about what people are willing to do when they believe that cruelty is justice. So, stay with me. Because to understand what happened to Queen Brunhilde, you must first understand who she was, and why her enemies believed that destroying her body would destroy her story. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. Before she was the old woman standing naked before a jeering crowd, she was a princess. Her name was Brunhilde, born around the year 543, in a world still shivering from the collapse of Rome. The Visigothic kingdom, a homeland, stretched across what we now call Spain and southern France, a land of stone castles, divided loyalties, and endless wars. From the moment she was born, her life was not her own. She was not raised for freedom or dreams. She was raised for strategy. In her world, a princess was not a person. She was a tool, a piece to be moved across the board by men who never imagined she might learn to play the game herself. But Brunhilde was not ordinary. Even her enemies would later admit that. She grew up surrounded by scholars and priests, absorbing everything: language, law, politics, history. While others thought her beauty would be her power, Brunhilde quietly sharpened her mind instead. She learned to read when most kings could not. She learned Roman law when most rulers ruled by impulse and sword. Knowledge became her weapon, and patience her armor. When she was 23, her father arranged her marriage to King Sigebert of Austrasia, a man who ruled part of what is now France and Germany. It was meant to be a political alliance, one of many cold marriages between kingdoms that pretended to be united while plotting against each other. But something rare happened. They fell in love. The chronicles, written by men who disliked her, still could not erase that fact. Sigebert and Brunhilde ruled together. He trusted her counsel, and she rewarded that trust with loyalty and wisdom. For a brief time, peace touched her life. She bore him children. She helped shape a court known for its order and justice. Under their rule, roads were repaired, trade revived, and people spoke of stability in an age that had forgotten the word. But peace is fragile, especially in a world built on pride and blood. And it shattered the moment her sister was murdered. Her younger sister, Galswintha, had been sent to marry Sigebert's brother, King Chilperic of Neustria. It was supposed to be another alliance, another political knot between royal families. But Chilperic had a mistress, a servant named Fredegund, who refused to be replaced by a foreign queen. Within a year, Galswintha was found strangled in her bed. Everyone knew who was responsible. Fredegund didn't even try to hide it, and Chilperic, instead of punishing her, married her. He made the murderer of Brunhilde's sister his queen. From that moment, a flame was lit inside Brunhilde that would never go out. It was the flame of vengeance, not for greed, not for conquest, but for justice. Two women now stood on opposite sides of a continent, bound by hatred and blood. Fredegund, the servant who rose by poison and murder. Brunhilde, the queen who ruled by intellect and law. Their war would last for 46 years. And it would consume kingdoms, children, and generations not yet born. But in those early days, Brunhilde could not yet see how it would end, only that her sister's death had changed everything. The world had just declared war on her. When King Sigebert was murdered, the world expected Brunhilde to vanish, quietly, obediently, as widows were supposed to. But Brunhilde was not built for disappearance. She buried her husband with the dignity of a ruler, not the despair of a victim. Then she turned to face the world that had just stolen everything from her. They thought they had ended her power. In truth, they had only unchained it. For the first time, Brunhilde ruled alone, not as a wife or daughter, but as queen and regent of a wounded kingdom. She had no army of her own, no husband beside her, only her mind, her voice, and the loyalty she had earned from those who had seen her courage. At first, even her allies whispered that she would not last. They said a woman could not rule men, that she would fall within weeks. But she outlasted them all. She began to rebuild roads, laws, and the fragile trust between her people and their throne. Under Brunhilde, the kingdom of Austrasia became something rare in a brutal age, a place where order mattered more than blood, and justice more than greed. She repaired the Roman roads that still wound through the forests, keeping the arteries of trade alive. She reformed taxation, punished corrupt nobles, and strengthened the church's role as a stabilizing power. She wrote letters to the Pope himself, discussing governance and faith as an equal, not as a subject. In a century where kings ruled by the sword, Brunhilde ruled by the mind. And that made her dangerous. The nobles began to murmur. They saw in her the rebirth of something they feared, a strong central power. For generations, they had carved their own fiefdoms, ruling villages and valleys as if they were kings themselves. A queen who understood Roman law and administration threatened all of it. They began to see her not as a ruler, but as a storm gathering on their horizon. And yet, the people loved her. The peasants spoke of the queen who fixed roads and restored order. Merchants praised her because trade flourished again. Priests admired her devotion to faith and her ability to bring peace after endless bloodshed. But peace never lasts long in a world built on envy. And as Brunhilde's influence grew, so did the hatred of those who could not stand to see a woman succeed where they had failed. They began to whisper the oldest weapon in the world, stories. They called her proud, then ambitious, then ruthless. Soon, their lies grew darker. They said she practiced witchcraft. They said she murdered her enemies in secret. They said she had gone mad with power. And in time, the rumors became more powerful than truth itself. While her enemies plotted in the shadows, Brunhilde continued to build. She raised new monasteries and churches. She established schools for the sons of nobles, the same nobles who were plotting against her. She believed knowledge could tame violence. But she was wrong. Knowledge frightens those who depend on ignorance to rule. The nobles waited. They smiled in her presence, bowed before her court, but behind those polite gestures, they sharpened their knives. They told themselves that removing Brunhilde was not murder, it was survival. And they waited for the right moment to strike. But Brunhilde was not easy to trap. Every betrayal she uncovered, she answered with calm precision. Every rebellion she crushed, she replaced with reform. She ruled for decades, weaving her influence through generations. But time is patient, and so are enemies. And her greatest enemy was still waiting, across the borders, in another kingdom, raised on hatred, raised on stories of vengeance. The son of her sister's killer. Clotho too. He was the shadow she could not escape, the heir to a blood feud that had begun before he was even born. And when his moment came, he would not come for her crown. He would come for her memory. By the time Brunhilde reached her 70th year, she had ruled longer than most men of her age had lived. She had outlasted kings, buried husbands, children, and grandchildren. She had seen her enemies rise, fall, and rot beneath the same earth they once ruled. But age, for all its wisdom, could not protect her from betrayal. The nobles of Austrasia had waited years, some of them decades, for their chance. They had watched as this woman, whom they once dismissed as a temporary regent, became the most experienced ruler in Europe. They saw her age not as proof of endurance, but as weakness. And when they looked at her, they no longer saw a queen. They saw a problem that needed solving. Her enemies whispered a single name among themselves, Clotha II. The son of Fredegund, the woman Brunhilde had warred against for half a century. The boy who had grown up hearing stories of how Brunhilde had destroyed his family. The man who had waited all his life for revenge. He was ruthless, clever, and patient. And he understood what Brunhilde's nobles wanted, freedom from her control. Freedom from the order she had built. Freedom from the laws she enforced. He gave them what they desired most, permission. He sent word across the borders, offering forgiveness to any noble who would betray her. No punishment. No retribution. Only mercy and gold. One by one, her allies began to fall silent. One by one, they switched sides. Brunhilde must have known. She had lived too long, ruled too wisely, to be blind to the cracks forming beneath her throne. But still, she stood firm. Even as messages stopped arriving, even as her guards grew uncertain, even as familiar faces began to vanish from her court. When Clotha's armies crossed the border, she waited for her soldiers to respond, but they did not. They opened the gates instead. The queen who had rebuilt kingdoms was betrayed not by enemies in battle, but by men she had trusted to defend her. Men who had eaten at her table. Men who had sworn oaths to her name. And so, the once mighty Brunhilde, a queen who had ruled for half a century, was handed over to her greatest enemy. When Clotha saw her, she was no longer the figure from his mother's nightmares. She was an old woman. Her face marked by time, her hands thin, her eyes weary but still proud. And yet, when he looked at her, he saw not an elder. He saw a symbol, the ghost of his family's hatred. To him, Brunhilde was not a person. She was vengeance waiting to be claimed. Clotha accused her of everything he could imagine. Murder, treason, sorcery, 10 kings dead by her hand, he declared. It was absurd, but he didn't care about truth. He only cared about spectacle. And the nobles who betrayed her stood beside him, nodding, pretending to believe every word. Because admitting the lie would mean admitting their own cowardice. Brunhilde stood before them in silence. She had faced armies before. But this was something else. This was the quiet violence of betrayal. She must have understood what was coming. She had seen it done to others, the stripping of dignity, the theater of cruelty, the crowd's hunger for punishment. But she also understood something her enemies did not. That they could destroy her body, but they could not control what people remembered. And so, when Clotha demanded she confess to his list of invented crimes, she refused. She refused him his story. She refused to make his lies eternal. And that single act of defiance, small, quiet, unrecorded by many, would echo through time. Her enemies thought they were preparing an execution. In truth, they were building a monument, not to her guilt, but to their own fear. Because the most dangerous thing in the world is not a woman with power. It is a woman who refuses to surrender her truth. The year was 613. The air outside the city of Renève was cold and heavy with mist. A field had been cleared for the spectacle. Thousands gathered, nobles, peasants, soldiers, priests, all drawn by the promise of a show. They came not to witness justice, but to feed on cruelty. In the center of that field stood an old woman in chains. Her hair, once gold and silver, now clung to her shoulders in thin strands. Her body trembled, not from fear, but from exhaustion. She was 70 years old, a lifetime of surviving plagues, wars, and betrayals. And now, after everything she had endured, Queen Brunhilde stood naked beneath the eyes of her world. The crowd erupted. Some laughed. Some pointed. Others threw handfuls of dirt and garbage at her. This was no execution, it was a performance. They tore the clothes from her body, leaving her bare before thousands. In her world, a queen's body was meant to be sacred, covered in layers of silk and gold. To strip her was to strip away her power, her identity, her humanity. But she did not kneel. She stood as straight as her chains allowed. Her body old, fragile, and marked by years, yet still the body of a queen. And in her silence, in her refusal to beg, she turned their cruelty into shame. For the people who laughed saw something they did not expect. A woman who would rather face death naked than live with humiliation clothed. That was the first day. On the second, they paraded her. They placed her on the back of a camel, not a horse, which would have given her dignity, but a creature chosen to make her look absurd. In the lands of the Franks, camels were foreign, strange, associated with faraway deserts. By putting her on one, they marked her as other, a reminder that she was not one of them, that she had ruled a land that never fully accepted her. They led her through villages and roads she had once repaired, past bridges she had ordered rebuilt, under towers that still bore her name. Everywhere she went, people came to watch. Some stared in silence, others shouted insults, but none could look away. It was not a parade, it was a warning. A warning to every woman who might dream of ruling, who might believe she could stand equal to a man. A warning carved not in words, but in humiliation. And through it all, Brunhilde stayed silent. The chronicles say she looked straight ahead, unblinking. They say she refused to speak, refused to curse, refused to give them satisfaction. Perhaps she knew that silence, too, can be a weapon, a way to deny them the comfort of hearing her pain. That night, they tied her to a stake, left her in the open field. The cold bit into her skin, and the jeers of the crowd echoed until dawn. She did not break. Then came the third day. The day meant to end her story forever. Clotho ordered that she be tied to a horse, not seated, but bound. Some say her hair was tied to the tail. Others say her arms and legs were fastened to different ropes. All the stories agree on one thing: it was meant to destroy her slowly. The horse was wild, terrified, and when they struck it, it bolted. The crowd screamed, not in horror, but in excitement. They had come to see blood, and now they saw it. The old queen was dragged across the dirt and stones, her body breaking with every jolt. The people who once cheered her name now cheered her suffering. And still, she did not scream loud enough for them to hear. When it was finally over, when the horse had run itself tired and there was nothing left of the woman who had ruled half of Europe, they burned what remained. No tomb. No grave. No monument. Only ashes, scattered by the same wind that carried their laughter. But the fire that Clotho lit that day did not destroy Brunhilde's memory. It illuminated it. Because what was meant as an ending became a beginning, a lesson that would echo for centuries. What they did to her was not justice. It was fear pretending to be justice. It was revenge pretending to be righteousness. It was the destruction of a woman who dared to rule without apology. They thought they were erasing her. But instead, they carved her story into history so deeply that even 14 centuries later, we still speak her name. Brunhilde. The queen who would not bow. The woman they tried to forget. After the fire died, after the crowd drifted away, the earth outside Renève was silent again. Only ashes remained, the ashes of a woman who had once ruled kingdoms. But the silence did not last. Because Clotho too, the man who had ordered her death, understood something every tyrant knows, that killing a person is not enough. You must also kill their story. And so, the rewriting began. Chroniclers, the official writers of kings, put ink to parchment and shaped the tale of Queen Brunhilde into something that would please their master. They wrote that she had murdered 10 kings. They wrote that she had poisoned her husband, her children, her grandchildren. They wrote that she was wicked, vain, dangerous, a queen who had betrayed her own blood. They said that her execution was not cruelty but justice. That her humiliation was not vengeance but order. That her death had restored peace to the land. It was a lie. But it was written in beautiful Latin, copied by monks, and spread through every monastery and court in Europe. And over time, the lie hardened into history. For more than 1,000 years, people remembered Brunhilde as the evil queen, the monster who got what she deserved. Students read about her as a warning. Priests used her story to teach obedience. Even historians repeated her enemies' words, never questioning where they came from. The real woman, the builder, the reformer, the survivor, disappeared beneath the layers of lies written by men who had feared her. But lies have cracks. And sometimes, centuries later, light finds a way in. Hidden in old records, the kind kings rarely bothered to destroy, pieces of the truth survived. In the ruins of bridges, carved stones still bore her name. In ancient letters to the Pope, her words still spoke of law, mercy, and reason. In records of land and taxes, a signature appeared again and again, proof of a woman who worked, ruled, and tried to build order in chaos. Slowly, historians began to see another Brunhilde, one who had done the same things men were praised for, yet was punished for doing them as a woman. They found that the accusations against her were impossible. She could not have killed 10 kings, she outlived them, yes, but most had died of war or disease. They found that the so-called crimes she was condemned for were simply the actions of a ruler trying to keep her realm from falling apart. And then they saw what her enemies had really done. They had turned her life into a cautionary tale, not for kings, but for women. A warning whispered through centuries, do not rise too high. Do not rule too long. Do not forget your place. That was Clotho's true victory. Not his brief unification of the Frankish lands. Not the peace he claimed to have restored. But the fear he planted in every woman who came after Brunhilde, fear of what happens when a woman refuses to step aside. For centuries, queens ruled through husbands and sons. Their names were recorded in the margins of history, never in the center. Because everyone remembered what happened to the queen who had stood alone. Brunhilde's death ended her body. But her silence, her refusal to confess, her refusal to give her enemies their story, kept the truth alive, buried deep beneath the lies, waiting for someone to dig it out again. And now, after 14 centuries, we can finally see her for what she was, not a monster, but a mirror. A reflection of what power does when it feels threatened. A reminder that fear of women's strength has always worn the mask of righteousness. She died in chains, but her story did not. It slipped through time like smoke, outlasting the men who burned her. More than 1,400 years have passed since Queen Brunhilde was dragged into that field. The kingdoms she ruled have turned into nations, the names of her enemies have faded into dust, and the stones of her castles have long since fallen. But her story remains. It remains because it tells us something that time has not erased, about power, about cruelty, and about how easily people can be convinced that injustice is righteous. When Brunhilde stood in that field, stripped before thousands, she was not just one woman being punished. She was a symbol. To her enemies, she was a warning. To history, she became a question. What happens when a woman refuses to bow? Her story is not just about one queen. It is about the fear that shaped her world, and still shapes ours. The fear that if a woman holds too much power, she must be broken. That if she leads too long, she must be silenced. That if she stands alone, she must be made into a lesson. That fear did not die with Clotha. It changed its face. It learned new languages. It hides now in quieter places, in the way powerful women are judged more harshly, in the way ambition is turned into arrogance, in the way confidence is called defiance. The same forces that built Brunhilde's fire still live among us, only now, they burn reputations instead of bodies. And the crowd still gathers. Not in a field this time, but behind screens and voices, ready to watch someone fall, ready to believe that cruelty can be justice if the story sounds convincing enough. That is the truth her story forces us to see, that people do not always commit evil because they are monsters. Sometimes they do it because they think they are good. Because they have been told a story that makes cruelty feel right. The people who laughed at Brunhilde did not think of themselves as cruel. They thought they were righteous. They thought they were watching the punishment of a wicked queen. And that should terrify us. Because it means the line between justice and vengeance is thinner than we like to admit. Brunhilde's story asks us to look at that line, to ask ourselves which side we would stand on if we were there in that field. Would we have turned away? Would we have laughed? Would we have believed the lies? We like to think we would have seen the truth. But the truth is rarely clear in the moment. It hides behind the noise, behind the crowd, behind the stories we are told. That is why remembering matters. Because forgetting allows the same things to happen again, only in different forms. Brunhilde's execution was meant to erase her, but it became her monument instead. Her enemies wanted her to vanish. Instead, she became a voice across centuries, whispering that power always demands stories to justify itself, and that those stories are not always true. She refused to confess. She refused to make her own death look righteous. And that small act, that refusal, left a crack in the lies wide enough for truth to crawl through. Because of that, we can see her now not as a monster, not as the wicked queen her enemies invented, but as what she truly was, a capable ruler destroyed for being too capable, a woman punished for doing what men were praised for. And that makes her story more than history. It makes it a mirror, showing us the patterns we still repeat, the crowds we still join, the lies we still believe. Maybe that is why we should remember her. Not just as a queen, but as a question. A question that asks, when the next Brunhilde stands before us, misunderstood, accused, humiliated, will we be the ones who look away? Or will we be the ones who finally refuse to join the crowd? Because in the end, history is not written by kings. It is written by those who remember. And remembering is a kind of justice that no fire can burn away. Brunhilde died in a field, but her dignity did not. They destroyed her body, but not her courage. They buried her name in lies, but truth is stubborn, it waits, it endures, and eventually, it speaks again. And now, you know what they tried to erase. A queen who ruled with wisdom. A woman who refused to kneel. A story that survived its own destruction. Remember her. Not for how she died, but for how she refused to disappear.